And this for me is quite big as well, and I think that's something that I've been personally taking on my hands as well, where I'm reading all of these stories in the media, and especially about the provider that has closed down. And the stories are actually not true. They are showing these students as victims, but not all of them are victims. They're actually, it's just the fruit of their own sowing. And I will sort of talk more into it, but I think what that is doing, it's actually causing a lot of confusion and clarity in the minds of the other students. I think Katie and I have been in a lot of conversations where we realize that pathway for majority of these students who've got absolutely low or almost negligent levels of English, I don't know how they got here, that's a separate story, is actually to return. And yet, the story is different. So that's what I think are the issues. What has happened? That's obviously what's happened, that the English testing requirement was removed. And I think that's when a can of worms was opened, and it became open season for private establishments and agents to make a lot of money, basically. My question is, what were the credibility checks of the alternatives that were accepted at that time? Because at that time, when English language or IELTS was removed, there was still medium of English letters that were required. There were still interviews that were required to be done with the provider. There was also sometimes interviews, even face-to-face, done with INZ. So that's a big question mark. I don't have the answers, but that's something that I ask INZ. I also think that there was too much power that was put in the hands of unscrutinized providers. Was anybody checking or overseeing what they're doing? How did they decide that this provider can actually test for the students' English and say that they meet the requirement? Did NZQ have any involvement in this? I have no idea. So this is the provider that closed down, obviously affected lots of students. The media went rampant. But the actual story is, most of these students were non-IELTS. Actually, almost all of them were non-IELTS students. They were on the verge of completing their level 6 programs. Most had done level 5 from either INZ or from another provider. They were asked to take tests after the reassessment, which some took and some didn't. And the reality is that most had English well under IELTS 5, 3, 4. They couldn't even understand English. And so obviously the options were, if they were going to get an English course here, that wasn't really going to make much of a difference in the bigger picture anyways. And the bigger story was that most of these were looking for alternatives, so I'll get onto that a bit later. What I also find really interesting is that almost all, I wouldn't say 100% because I don't actually have the actual stats, but close to about 100% of students for this provider were from a state called Punjab. Why? I actually think that this implies, because if you look deeper, a lot of the marketing managers and the marketing team were actually from here. And then if you start looking behind their backgrounds, this is not the first time that they worked with a provider that's closed down. I'm quite openly stating this. I think this needs to be kept in mind. And I find this really, really surprising. Again, going back to my point, because NZQ doesn't actually talk with INZ. INZ had actually issued visas till quite late. So had they known that there were issues with the provider which were happening well before they actually closed down, maybe this could have been avoided. I'm not sure. This is what is happening and has been happening. There were options for affected students. Now I do absolutely feel terrible for these guys. I think a lot of them are victims, but they're just victims of really bad advice to begin with. Had the authorities been tighter, they probably wouldn't have ended here. And for a lot of those students, they've taken the IELTS. Some we're requesting for visitors with immigration to allow them to take their English test so that they've got some more time to prepare. Some who've scored almost English IELTS 5.5, they've got the option of slightly more training in English so they can actually get to the required IELTS. But some who've got IELTS 3 and 4, 6 months of English is not really going to make any difference. And in fact, this is a fact that after talking to majority of these guys, they were looking for alternatives. And the alternatives that they were looking for were not really a path that they should be. Okay, yeah. So just on the IELTS, so when they did get IELTS 3 and 4, my question obviously relates to what was the credibility of the actual English meeting requirements that were done offshore. I'm not sure if there was anything done at all. So obviously the reality is that they are all looking for, most of them with that low English, they are looking for alternatives. And the alternatives that they're looking for is obviously going to lead to a rise of fake partnerships and compliance issues because they will end up becoming unlawful. So that's really not a path for the people who can absolutely speak no English. I'm not sure how they pass the level 5, but I think that's a place where we really don't want to get to. I personally believe that there are some brilliant, genuine students amongst those who we are trying to counsel, but there is no one answer for all. There is individual counseling required for these students. And again, the media also talks about students being deported. I've spoken to Katie. There is actually no students who've actually been deported. There are voluntary departures, but there hasn't been any deportations. Have they? No. So there is no single student actually deported. And yet the media talks about students getting deported. So I think that's what's happened has happened. I mean, we can't go back and change it. And I know that the ball's been dropped by the NZQA, it's been dropped by INZ. We can keep playing the blame game. But what I'm saying is, we know that those students, some of them should have never come to New Zealand. Granting them another visa would be another wrong, and two wrongs don't make it a right. And I think that's the perspective that I'm trying to give to this situation. And I only wish that hopefully next year Indian students are going to be in the news, but not in the way that they have been in the last 2 years, because I almost take it as a personal responsibility, being one of them.